We're so glad to have Dr. Andrew Unsworth with us this afternoon. He is one of the organists for the Tabernacle Choir on Temple Square. He's been there for how long now? 14 years?
Almost, yeah.
Almost 14 years. I met Andy when he just started working as the organist, and then he became my teacher a couple years later, and he's just a phenomenal organist. So without further ado, why don't we get started?
Okay. So I'm really happy to be here. It's always fun to talk about yourself. So thanks, Melanie, for giving me that opportunity. It's been a weird past 8 or 9 months with not a whole lot of contact with other people, certainly not with any other organists aside from my colleagues. So anyway, it's nice to be here. So what I'll be talking about a little bit, Melanie's request, I'll talk about the work of the Tabernacle organists and a little bit about our facilities, our instruments here, and then I'll focus on the history of the Tabernacle organ and a little bit about what I've learned about using the Tabernacle organ, kind of some strategies I've adopted, some things that I've learned to appreciate about the design. And to start with, I thought I would show a video of a recording that we made back in March of 2020. It's a recording of a Latter-day Saint hymn. The hymn tune is Redeemer of Israel. Now, I don't know that's in any other hymnal, although there's nothing uniquely Mormon about this hymn. But to Latter-day Saints is a particularly beloved hymn, and we recorded it back in March. Our church has a semi-annual general conference, and I'll talk about that a little bit. It's a big deal for us, and the Tabernacle Choir sings a lot of music for it. And we were pre-recording music in March for this April conference, just in case COVID made it impossible for us to provide live music. And as it turned out, we ended up using these pre-recorded hymns for general conference because the music was not live. And you'll see in the video 2 organists on the bench, me and my colleague Brian Matthias. And because we have a staff of 5 organists, our music directors often write their accompaniments with 2 organists in mind. And so it makes for a more complicated and colorful accompaniment. And it's also fun to play with colleagues. I really enjoy that part, but it's a challenge. If you're the organist on the left, as I am in this recording, you're usually the one playing the pedals, but you're shifted to the left. So you're off center. So everything is not where you're accustomed to it being. And if you're the player on the right, usually you're mostly playing on the upper manuals, but you're having to stretch to play those upper manuals because we have 5 manual instruments. So, and you're also having to reach way up and over. So it's just awkward and uncomfortable. And we're all gonna have back problems, I'm sure. So let's listen to this Redeemer of Israel recording, and then we'll proceed from there. Tabernacle Choir has 3 full-time organists and 2 part-time organists, and we share the load, which is great. When I got the job, it seemed like it was going to be a piece of cake because I'd never worked anywhere that had multiple organists, but there's enough to do to certainly justify that that number of staff. So our main role is to support the Tabernacle Choir in its rehearsals and in concerts, recordings on tours, and also at the church's semi-annual general conference that recording we just saw was for. Our main thing that we do, our bread and butter really, is working with the choir in its weekly radio and television broadcast, which is called Music in the Spoken Word. I don't know how many of you have seen it, but it's the world's longest continuous network broadcast. It's been going since 1929, every week. And Music in the Spoken Word, it's a live 30-minute program of music with around a 3-minute sermonette. And it's mostly sacred music, but it's not church. It's not intended to be church. It's kind of just a presentation of mostly sacred music with a little inspirational, non-denominational message in the middle. And in the year 2000, the choir started an orchestra, and the role of that orchestra has become larger since then. You know, from 1929 until 2000, the choir was only accompanied by organ. But the role of the orchestra has grown over the years, and now on the broadcast, they provide the bulk of the choir accompaniment, and the organist serves as a member of the orchestra when the orchestra is there. There is still the occasional broadcast, it's just organ and choir, but that's become less frequent. I've been working for the choir for almost 14 years, and it used to be about once a month, and now it's probably 3 or 4 times a year that we have an organ-only broadcast. But still, the organ, even though the orchestra has kind of taken over a lot of the accompaniment duties for the choir's broadcast, the organ is still important. There's an organ solo every broadcast, usually anywhere between 2 and 4 minutes. And the organ is the glue that holds the broadcast together. The broadcast, like I said, it's a live broadcast. We do it at 9:30 in the morning, and it starts right at 9:30, and it lasts 27 minutes and 56 seconds. So we're off the air at 9:57 and 56 seconds, and it usually falls to the organist to make the broadcast fill that time slot. The music director normally creates a program that's a little light on time, and so the organist often has to play a time pad anywhere between 50 and 90 seconds to help make the broadcast last long enough. And we don't normally know how long that time pad is going to be until right before the broadcast starts. There's also, during that little sermonette, we're supposed to improvise, we improvise underneath the little sermonette, and it's pretty corny, but the spoken word music that we play, it serves to set up harmonically whatever is next on the broadcast. And if the piece that follows the spoken word message is unaccompanied, then we're through our, whatever we're improvising, we're giving the choir their pitches so they can start. And over the air, you often can barely hear it, but in the room you certainly can. And it is kind of corny, but actually I kind of like doing it. It's a nice time to chill and in the broadcast for me. And then the broadcast always ends with the organ playing a Latter-day Saint hymn tune, As the Dew from Heaven Distilling. And if you've watched the broadcast before, we use a very characteristic signature tabernacle organ sound. It's Alexander Schreiner from the 1940s radio sound, kind of like 1940s funeral home organ registration. But it's such a part of the history of the place that even though it's corny, I love doing it, and I consider it a privilege to be able to play that tune in that context in the broadcast. So playing the broadcast is primarily the responsibility of the full-time organist, the tabernacle organist. And since there are 3 of us, we're on the hot seat every 3 weeks, more or less. Sometimes the schedule gets tweaked, so you have only 2 weeks between broadcasts, and sometimes you have more or less time. But even though the orchestra is there a lot and is providing the bulk of the accompaniment, usually you're playing, there's usually an organ part on at least probably 75% of the things. And sometimes there are substantial organ parts where you kind of take over. And you still have to learn all the reductions because the orchestra is not there all the time that the choir is there. So in addition to all that, and playing your solo and the other little bits, playing a broadcast is fairly time consuming. Plus it's live, and you only get one shot. And so you want to be as prepared as you can. So I still, whenever there's a broadcast on the horizon for me, it kind of takes over. So the other thing that I mentioned, we play General Conference, and General Conference, it's semi-annual for Latter-day Saints. We do it, it's the first weekend of April and the first weekend of October, and there are 5 2-hour-long sessions spread out over that weekend. You know, there are 3 sessions on Saturday and 2 on Sunday. And there's quite a bit of choral music that happens at General Conference, and it's all accompanied just by organ. So that's when we get to do our traditional thing of organ accompaniment. And there's quite a bit of 4-hand accompaniment that goes on at General Conference, as well as substantial organ prelude and postlude. And it goes out live to a worldwide church of about 17 million people. So it's a super high pressure thing. Probably the scariest thing that I do is to play for General Conference, even though it's not the most technically difficult thing we do for sure. It is scary. Another big part of what we do is we play daily organ recitals. And well, I'm talking about what we do in the context of what we used to do before COVID came along. So we have a tradition of daily organ recitals in the Tabernacle going back to 1908. And in the summertime, this recitals at noon in the Tabernacle, but in the summertime we repeat that same program in the Conference Center, which is a big organ across the street in a 21,000 seat auditorium. So you'll play it twice. And I play 1 or 2 of these recitals a week, depending upon the broadcast schedule. And our part-time organists usually play twice a month. And then we have a roster of guest organists in the community and around the country who help us by playing recitals. They often will take holidays and weekends so we can be at home with our families. And Melanie is one of our guest organists. So she plays recitals for us. I have very few administrative duties. So my main job really is to practice. I'm really spoiled. Getting ready, so there's plenty to practice for, whether it's recitals or broadcasts or concerts. And we have some really great practice facilities I'll show you in a minute. That's my colleague, Richard Elliott, who is in the middle of a bow in that picture. During COVID, so in March, the choir, we stopped rehearsing, performing, and broadcasting. We still have a weekly broadcast, but it's all stuff that we've done in the past. And so, you know, I got texts from people today saying, good job on the broadcast. And it's nice to get credit for something that I already did. I didn't have to sweat over. And we stopped our daily noon recitals. The buildings are still closed to the public. But in June, we started a new endeavor that we're calling Piping Up. And we started streaming organ recitals from the Tabernacle and Conference Center on YouTube and Facebook Live. And we started doing it on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And it was a live recital. And they decided they wanted us to have an announcer instead of having us announce our own stuff, when I was happy to let someone else do it. And so we asked a Brigham Young University music history professor to be our announcer. And I don't know if any of you have seen it, but he does a really great job. He's a smart guy. He's a member of the Tabernacle Choir, so he knows his way around the place, and he is good at making music history accessible. So he introduces our pieces and does a really fine job. And starting in January, we began doing it just once a week. We're looking forward to things reopening on Temple Square, and 3 times a week of live streaming there's just no way we could do that with our regular schedule. And there's been enough interest in our live streaming recitals. Most recitals get between 20 and 30,000 views. Those views aren't all live. Most of the views actually happen after the fact, but you know, in the week to 10 days after a recital streams, usually we're pushing 20 to 30,000 views. At any rate, we dialed back to once a week so that we could make it sustainable. So we're going to continue doing this in the future. And it's not just the full-time organists, it's our part-time organists as well who are participating. And so doing it once a week makes it possible. And it also gives us a little breathing room I was feeling, because I was playing basically one of these live stream recitals a week, and it was kind of consuming me, because it's a lot more pressure to play a recital that you know is going to be stuck on YouTube than it is just to play a recital for whoever happens to be trapped in the building at the time. So at any rate, we were working really, really hard, and it was live. You know, we were getting one shot to play these recitals. So doing it once a week makes it sustainable. So that's hopefully will be a new offering that we'll have going into the future. Okay, now is when I should have started the slides, because I'm going to start talking about our facilities. So the picture that we're looking at is a picture of the Tabernacle organ. And the Tabernacle, it was completed in 1867. And it seats, this is a picture of the outside of the Tabernacle. So it's kind of an odd shaped building with this dome. Currently, the Tabernacle seats about 3,500 people. And before a 2007 renovation, it seated about 5,000 people. The renovation in 2007, they replaced all the pews and made them a little more spacious and comfortable. So we don't seat as many people anymore. And there are reports from the 19th century of them cramming over 12,000 people in the Tabernacle, which I cannot imagine. So this is what the Tabernacle organ looked like at the beginning. You see it's been enlarged and changed. I'll talk about the Tabernacle organ in greater detail in a minute. So this here is the conference center, and this is the 21,000 seat auditorium I was telling you about. It's really a remarkable space. Because it's so big, there were a lot of concerns about the acoustics of the building. The primary purpose of the conference center is for people to gather for our general conference, and where it's a lot about hearing the messages, spoken messages from the leaders of the church. They also wanted to make it good for music, but they were concerned about having too much echo, making speech unintelligible. And so every surface in that building was designed to absorb sound. And so we were really worried. Well, I wasn't on the staff then. They were really worried about it being awful for music. And so there was some discussion about whether they would just build a digital organ for that. But they opted to build a pipe organ, and this is the conference center organ. And we're also glad they did, because the acoustics turned out so much better than anyone anticipated. It's not a super live space, but there's a nice ring, and there's so many cubic feet of air in there. There's plenty of room for the music to bounce around. So that's the auditorium. So it's just absolutely gigantic. And the organ is built by Schoenstein from San Francisco, and Jack Bethards, who is the tonal director and president of Schoenstein, he describes it as an American romantic organ. So, you know, the Tabernacle organ is described as the quintessential American classic organ, and this organ in the conference center it's a fairly eclectic instrument, but because of the space, they opted to go with very full-bodied foundations. The idea was to be able to accompany a congregation singing a hymn without any amplification of the organ. And so it's loud. And when you pull out all the 16-foot stops in the pedal, it's just this big wall of sound. It's pretty substantial. The conference center organ has 7 32-foot stops and 2 64-foot stops. The 64-foot stops only go down to A flat. They don't go all the way down to the bottom. There's a lot of bass on this organ, and it fills its role as a member of the orchestra very well. I don't know if any of you play with orchestras or have heard organ with orchestra on recordings or in person, but I think the organ really shines as a member of the orchestra by just kind of filling out, really making a wonderful foundation and providing a really substantial bass. And this organ is very, very good at that. And there are mixtures, but the idea of this organ was that it gets most of its brilliance from the reeds, and the reeds are more English in character. Anyway, I love the conference center organ, and if it were in a cathedral acoustic, it would be like unbelievable. But in this space, I think it still works very well. And as an instrument for accompanying, it's incredible. It is a worthy foil to the Tabernacle Choir. So as you can tell, I like the conference center organ a lot. I've grown as I the more I play it, the more I like it. Very, very well designed. They kind of learned from the limitations of the tabernacle organ when they designed the conference center organ. So even though it's smaller in terms of the number of pipes, it is a very versatile instrument. Okay, so here's the other big organ that we have on Temple Square is in this building, which is called the Assembly Hall. And it's a building built in the 1880s. And here's the organ in that space, built by Robert Sipe of Dallas. And it was completed in, I think, 1982. So it's definitely a period piece. Mechanical action, you can see from the flame copper pipes, that was kind of all the rage in the early 80s. It is in its conception, they were trying to do something that was more classical or North German inspired, but as you might expect from an organ from the 80s, they didn't really know what they were doing in terms of building Baroque organs. But I can't rip on it too much. I think the organ, it is not a pins and needles neo-Baroque organ like some of you may have played. The foundations are warm. The reeds are more Germanic. It's a much smaller hall. It's really quite a pretty little hall. I like it a lot. But it's the only of the three big organs, the only one that's in mechanical action. And I think they did a really good job with it, especially considering when it was built. In the basement of the assembly hall, we have three practice organs. And so you can see the one on the left is by Austin, and it's from 1963. I guess the console is from 1963, but the chest and pipework from the 80s. And then the Cassavan is from the late 70s. It's a Larry Phelps instrument. And then on the right is this 3-manual tracker organ by Ken Coulter that can be hand pumped. And it has suspended tracker action, very light suspended tracker action. And it is hard to play. And it's, I think of the three organs, it probably gets the least amount of use because it's a tendonitis inducing machine. At least that's how I feel about it. If you can play cleanly there, of course, you can play cleanly anywhere, but the action is so light. I don't like practicing on it very much. I spend most of my time on the Cassavan or the Austin. And of course, we can practice on the big organs too. Because we have a staff of 5 people, you can't always get on the big organs also. And it's good to be in a small space. There are often tours that are going through all the other, the big buildings. And, we're allowed to practice through those tours, but I always feel bad if I'm learning notes and there are tours going through, or even if I'm just, making a big mess and there are tours going through. So I try to take care of my note learning in private. Okay, so now talk a little bit about the tabernacle organ. So this instrument here, the tabernacle organ, was built by Joseph Ridges, who was an English carpenter and cabinet maker. And he actually had no formal training as an organ builder. Apparently, he grew up in South London. And apparently, there was an organ factory near his boyhood home, and he was fascinated by organs and spent some time hanging around with people who worked in the factory and learned a little bit about how organs worked and how they were put together. And then he emigrated to Australia, and that's where he met missionaries from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and joined the church. And at some point during his time in Australia, he built his first organ, which was a 7-stop instrument. And at that time, the church was encouraging all people who joined it to come to Utah. And so he and his family got on a boat, and he brought this organ with him and set it up on Temple Square in a building that no longer exists. But because he had experience, he was the only person really who had any experience with organ building. The church was in its infancy in Utah at the time. Brigham Young called him in and said, we're going to build a tabernacle, this big building, and we want to build an instrument that is commensurate with the size and grandeur of the building. And Brigham Young wondered if it was possible to do it, because at this point in the early 1860s, the railroad hadn't come through Salt Lake City yet. So any materials either had to be found locally or brought by wagon from the east. And Joseph Ridges said that he thought it was possible. There are some good sources of pine in southern Utah, this place called Pine Valley near St. George in southern Utah. Joseph Ridges did take a trip to Boston to buy some pipes, some wire, and a few other things from the organ building firm of Simmons. And while he was in Boston, Joseph Ridges saw this. I don't know if any of you have been here to Methuen, Massachusetts, to hear or play this instrument, but this organ in the early 1860s was being set up in the Boston Music Hall. So Ridges saw this, and you can see the similarities between the two cases. You know, the Boston Music Hall organ is much more ornate. You can see the really ornate carvings on the bottom and top, and the Tabernacle organ really doesn't have much. There's a little bit on the top, but not much on the bottom. So he was inspired by what he was seeing going in at the Boston Music Hall and designed the Tabernacle organ case after that. I'll show you a few historical pictures of the Tabernacle organ, this choir. You can see the console down front, right next to the conductor. The original Tabernacle organ, it was a mechanical action organ, obviously. It was first used in a general conference in 1867, and then it was later expanded in the 1880s to a 4-manual instrument. The original was just three manuals with about 1,600 pipes. And then in the 1880s, it was enlarged to 4 manuals and 57 stops. And then at that point in the 1880s, they added a water motor. And I don't know if any of you were aware, but back when running water became common in American cities, it was normal for towns and cities to give churches free running water. And so they would take advantage of this by powering things with hydraulic motors. And so it was fairly common for there to be hydraulic motors powering the wind of an organ. So the Tabernacle organ was powered by one of these hydraulic motors in the 1880s. And then around the turn of the 20th century, the organ was electrified. So here's another kind of funny picture. You can see the organ is unfinished. You look around to the left side of it, and it says Mammoth Organ Tabernacle, 48 feet high, contains 3,200 pipes. So they would, I don't know what they would say if they knew how big the Tabernacle organ is now with 11,623 pipes. So the organ, as I said, was 1867 built, then enlarged in the 1880s. And then in 1901, they asked the Kimball Organ Company of Chicago to rebuild the organ. And the manual compass was extended and the pedal compass also. And they really kind of started over. About 2/3 of the organ pipes from the original Pioneer organ were removed. And they built a very orchestral instrument with, an 8-foot wonder, very few higher pitches, lots of celestes. And they added pneumatic levers. But this organ, it was never very successful, both tonally and also mechanically. And mechanically, frankly, were the main problems. The big problems with the chests. And so in 1915, they brought in the Austin Organ Company, who put in completely new chests and changed the organ tonally completely. And this Austin organ from 1916, it had 100 ranks and 4 manuals. And it's this organ that was first used in the choir broadcasts. And so at that time in 1915-16 is when they extended the organ case and added these 2 wings on each side. And then 1929 is when, as I said, the radio broadcast began. And in the 1940s, this was, Albert Schweitzer and the whole Orgelbewegung thing was going on I think maybe even starting in the 1920s and 30s. And organists and organ builders were looking to the past to find inspiration for the future, right? And so we see this American classic style of organ building. And the organists at the time, the principal organist, his name was Alexander Schreiner, he went to G. Donald Harrison from the Alien Skinner Company and asked them to rebuild the organ. And this 1948 version of the organ is also almost a completely new instrument, with the exception of the 10 original facade pipes that still speak, and a few other ranks from the original organ. They chucked everything else and built a new instrument. So the organ stayed pretty much like that, untouched until the 1980s. And the organists at the time, they loved the Aeolian Skinner organ, but they having used it extensively for recitals and broadcasts, they were aware of its weaknesses. And there were a number of ranks that never really got finished. Some of the stops on the bombard and like the solo mixture never really got, or the bombard mixture never really got finished. And they're aware of the historical significance of the instrument, but they also needed to use the organ for accompanying and playing recitals. And so they decided that they brought in Schoenstein, the Schoenstein Organ Company, to regulate and finish fine-tune voicing for a few stops. And then they added 17 new ranks. These new ranks are all in the spirit of Aeolian Skinner, but just to help to make the organ a little bit more complete. And if you sat down at the organ console, I would dare you to try to guess which are the Schoenstein stops and which ones were the Aeolian Skinner and which ones were added by Schoenstein. They did a really, really great job and had a lot of respect for what Gene Otto Harrison had done. And I think, obviously I wasn't around working for the choir when that happened, but I understand that organists and the choir got some flack for touching the tabernacle organ. And it's a hard call. And I don't know if some of you have faced that in your work, but when you're trying to balance historical instrument versus actually using an instrument in practice. And I know they really struggled and they opted to go with practicality, although everything they did, as I said, is certainly in the spirit of Aeolian Skinner. When the tabernacle was closed for renovation in 2004 to 2007, the pipes were all taken out and the entire instrument was cleaned and everything was re-leathered. And in the 1980s, they added solid state memory levels. We had 256 memory levels added in the 80s. And with the 2007 renovation, they added like USB so we could have more memories on USB stick, which was nice. This past summer, there was fairly substantial work done on the organ, not on the organ pipes, but on the organ console. We got a new control system. So there were no tonal changes, but new control system, which gives us basically, well, they say infinite memory. Nothing is infinite, but we were running out of space with our 256 memory levels. And there are a few other issues. We also replaced the stop actions, which they were pneumatic. We were using the original 1948 stop actions, but they were quite noisy. And in a broadcast setting, if you ended a big organ solo with full organ, and if the next choir piece was quite soft, you couldn't cancel because the sound of canceling with all those pneumatic stop actions going back in, it would definitely be audible. And so you'd sit there with full organ, trying not to touch anything, waiting for the right moment when you could cancel. So I'm looking forward to having those new stop actions in a broadcast setting. And the organ, we just started using it again. There are still some issues that we're working through. And so it's not all perfect, but it's mostly there. And this is a photo of the console as it is now. So 5 manuals and pedal. All right. If you have a copy of the Tabernacle organ specification, you might want to pull it out. I'm just going to talk a little bit about using the Tabernacle organ. I didn't know how to register an organ like this the first time I sat down. It's a big organ. There's a lot to choose from. And the more I play the Tabernacle organ, the more impressed I am by its design. There's so many different levels of choruses. The Tabernacle organ, because the Tabernacle is famous for its acoustic, the Tabernacle organ is quite gently voiced. It's never oppressively loud, but there are so many levels of dynamics just because of all the various choruses. The swell, if you look at the swell specification, it's substantial, but of course it's a division under expression, and so it closes down. We have 2 different 8-foot chorus reeds and a 32-foot manual reed, as well as a quint trumpet, which is a little odd. You don't see that too many places. So there's that swell chorus with 2 mixtures, as well as the cornet, which is a mixture. So it's really 3 mixtures. Then there's a positive chorus, and the positive and the choir, they're both attached to the bottom keyboard. They're separate divisions, but both attached to the bottom keyboard. And you can float the positive. You can take it off of the bottom keyboard and float it up to the solo, or you can obviously couple it to the grate. And the positive was designed to be a secondary grate. So it's a very complete division with a full principal chorus, 8/4/2 and 2 high-pitched mixtures, as well as, all those flutes and flute mutations. So it's a very complete division, and it's intended to be a secondary grade. Then if you look at the grate, we have 3 8-foot diapasons, 4 mixtures, and the grate mixtures are such that they don't really overlap with the positive. Well, they do, but when you couple in the positive, it makes a big difference. So the intention of the design was that those two choruses work together and complement each other. And if you want to, if you're playing a concerto movement, you want to move to the grate, have an alternation like a grate chorus and a positive chorus, you can certainly do that, but they work well together, coupled. And then the bombard is another principal chorus with principals 8/4 and 2 mixtures, including a tierce mixture, which is kind of the crowning glory of the organ. I always save that for it's like the cymbal crash moment. And the intention was that the bombard is the loudest principal chorus of the organ. And back in the days when there were only 20 generals on the organ and no multiple memories, they had this coupler from the original 1948 organ, which I've never seen anywhere else. And the coupler is great tutti to solo. And what the coupler does is it couples anything that's on the grate, anything that's coupled to the grate, up to the solo bombard, the 4th keyboard. So it's really no different than coupling the bombard solo divisions to the grate. It accomplishes the same thing, but the nice thing is if you're playing along and you only have 20 generals, or if there's no way for you to press a piston, you can get all the resources of the solo and bombard by moving your hands up to that 4th keyboard. So it eliminates the need for a piston press. So we have all those, the bombard with the biggest principal chorus, the grate with the next biggest, the positive with the biggest after that, and then of course the swell. So you have all these different levels of principal choruses, when you're building up the organ. So you can build up one at a time, and it happens almost seamlessly. If you use the crescendo pedal, it happens almost seamlessly. It's pretty fantastic. The choir division, as most American and English choir divisions are. It's very mild, but still quite a complete division. And if you're looking at the specification, you can see that we have, principals 8 and 4 in a mixture. But if you are, focused on building choruses, the choir really isn't going to help you out much. All it's going to add is potentially out of tuneness, because it is so mild. It's not going to be able to compete with any of these other choruses. The pedal division, it's much more versatile now with the Brazos that Schoenstein added. There are a number of stops, 16-foot and 8-foot, as well as some color 4-foot reeds that were borrowed from the other keyboards. Pedal has 5 32-foot stops, and one of the unusual stops on the organ is there's a grand harmonics mixture, which is a 32-foot mixture. And the effect of that mixture, it's really like another 32-foot reed. And the great thing about it is because it's mutations, it doesn't have any speech issues. So if I'm building up the organ and I want, the grand harmonics might be the first 32-foot reed that I add, because it has a nice gnarliness to it. And it speaks quickly, so you can use it for a fast pedal line. The effect of the Tabernacle organ is it's really even from top to bottom, in contrast with the conference center organ, where the bass can really dominate. When you're playing in the Tabernacle, you have to learn to deal with the acoustics, and I'm sure Melanie can speak to this. It's not a very easy instrument to play, because as you're sitting at the console, you're hearing more reflected sound than direct sound. So the sound is going up and over your head, and you're hearing more of the bounce back than you're hearing directly to your ears. And it's especially noticeable when the pipes that you're playing are around the corner of the organ case. So around the corner from where you're sitting at the organ bench, the bombard and solo divisions. If you're playing any sort of melody and trying to emote or whatever, or if you're playing anything that's fast, you'll hear the thunk of your key hitting the key bed, and then you'll hear the sound, and the rhythm of the thunk and the rhythm of the sound, they're in totally different places. So you just have to kind of turn off your ears and keep going. It's not a very good feeling. playing with the Tabernacle Choir, it's a thrill to sit there at that organ and to have the singers right there. As I said, the instrument is quite mild, the voicing's unforced, and it's not a particularly loud instrument, especially compared to the conference center organ. And the result is, in the Tabernacle, you can use pretty much the whole organ with 360 singers. In the conference center, you have to be really, really careful, because if you're not, you can overwhelm and take over really easily. But when you're playing with orchestra in the Tabernacle, there are many times when you can't hear yourself play at all. In fact, this is funny to me now. It wasn't at the time. There was a time, a broadcast, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, where I was playing with the orchestra, and the broadcast always begins with the same hymn. It's Gently Raise the Sacred Strain, it's called. And the key of that hymn varies from week to week, depending upon the key of the first piece on the broadcast. And, I had looked at my broadcast repertoire, and I had grabbed the organ part for Gently Raise the Sacred Strain. And then during the broadcast, I thought, there's something wrong. There's something really wrong. And I realized I don't have perfect pitch, but I have pretty good pitch memory, and everything just kind of felt wrong. And I realized during the broadcast that I was playing in the wrong key, and I couldn't hear myself at all. But it sounded like the basses were really out of tune, and it sounded like, so as soon as I stopped playing about halfway through it, then suddenly everything was fine. And it turned out, I think that the music director had chosen that hymn in A major, and I was playing in an A flat or something. But there's a lot of times when I'm playing with the choir and orchestra and trying to blend, and I have no idea if I'm playing the right notes. You just hope you are. And when you're playing a recital in the Tabernacle, as you sit at the console, I think in some respects, it's the most reverberant or washy place to sit in the building. And so it's much more clear and clean for the audience, which is exactly what you don't want, right? Because you may think from where you sit that you played a really accurate recital, but you're the only one who doesn't know the reality of what just happened. So it is a challenging place to make music because of the shape of the dome. Where you're sitting as an audience member can has a big influence on what you're hearing. Some places where you're sitting, it sounds like if you were sitting exactly opposite the organ in the balcony, it sounds like you are sitting in the organ case. You're getting like a direct feed with no reverberation at all. It's kind of intense. Other places, there's a good mix of direct sound and reverberation, but it's a strange building. The Tabernacle is famous for its acoustics, I think mostly because you can speak without a microphone and be understood. And when the building was built back in the 19th century, there were no microphones, and so that was for the people who built the building. They thought that was a miraculous thing, because they didn't really understand acoustics and the fact that they could use the building well for the primary purpose it was designed for people to hear their local religious leaders speak. That was pretty amazing to them. Then it works well for music. It just, you have to be careful where you sit. And as a player, there are times where you might be sitting on stage and you're hearing, the trombones on the other side of the stage, and it sounds like they're behind you. It's just odd.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us, and we just appreciate it so much. People are saying thank you, and everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.